40 meters. That is how deep the wreck sat, cold, dark, and silent, swallowed by the South China Sea. Russian Navy divers had been down there for 6 hours. 6 hours of failed attempts, tangled lines, and rising panic inside the underwater command vessel anchored above. The mission was supposed to be routine. Recover a classified communications module from a sunken intelligence vessel before rival intelligence agencies could reach it first. Simple. Except nothing about 40 meters of black water, zero visibility, and a corroding steel hull is ever simple. And now, with oxygen reserves running critical and the weather topside deteriorating fast, the Russians were out of options. That was when the Filipino diver surfaced beside their boat and said 4 words that changed everything. Let us go down.
The year was 2003. The location was a classified stretch of water between Palawan and the Spratly Islands, an area the Philippine military knew better than any cartographer alive. The sunken vessel, a decommissioned Russian signals ship called the Karpov, had gone down 6 weeks earlier during a violent squall. It carried no crew casualties, but it carried something far more valuable than human lives, an encrypted communications relay module that contained routing keys for a network of deep-sea listening posts scattered across the Pacific. If that module fell into the wrong hands, it would compromise 2 decades of covert intelligence infrastructure. Moscow wanted it back, and they wanted it quietly.
Commander Alexei Voronov had led the Russian Navy's elite combat diving unit, the PDSS, for 11 years. His team of 8 divers were among the finest underwater operators in the world. They had trained in the frozen lakes of Siberia, conducted sabotage operations in the Black Sea, and recovered equipment from depths that would crush ordinary men. They arrived in Philippine waters under the cover of a maritime research cooperation agreement, their true mission buried beneath layers of diplomatic paperwork. They brought with them the best rebreather systems money could build, cutting-edge sonar mapping equipment, and the quiet arrogance that comes with being the best at what you do.
What Voronov did not bring was knowledge of the Palawan underwater shelf. He did not know about the thermocline layers that scrambled sonar readings in these specific waters. He did not know about the seasonal microcurrents that moved through the Spratly approaches like invisible rivers, shifting sediment and displacing buoy markers by dozens of meters overnight. He did not know that the South China Sea in this region behaved differently from any body of water his team had ever trained in. He had studied maps, he had read reports, but there is a difference between reading about the ocean and knowing it the way a man knows his own hands. Voronov was about to learn that difference.
Day 1 of the dive operation went badly from the first descent. The sonar mapping had placed the Karpov's hull at 34 meters depth and 300 meters northeast of their anchor position. What the sonar had not detected was the sediment drift that had buried the bow section under 2 meters of silt, shifting the accessible entry point entirely. 2 divers spent 40 minutes searching before they located the correct hatch. By the time they surfaced, their bottom time was exhausted, their nitrogen levels were elevated, and the window for a second dive that day had closed. Voronov stood on the deck and stared at the water with the controlled expression of a man refusing to show what he actually felt. They had achieved nothing.
Day 2 was worse. A diver named Grishin, the team's most experienced wreck penetration specialist, managed to enter the vessel through the secondary communications hatch on the starboard side. He navigated 40 feet of collapsed internal corridor, bypassed a flooded auxiliary compartment, and reached the primary relay room. The module was there. He could see the housing unit, partially dislodged from its mounting bracket, but intact. He attempted to detach the security coupling. The tool slipped in his gloves. The coupling sheared. The entire module dropped backward into a collapsed section of the flooring, now inaccessible without cutting equipment. Grishin surfaced with nothing but a bruised hand and the knowledge that the mission had just become 10 times harder. On the morning of day 3, a small banca boat appeared from the southwest. It moved with the easy confidence of a vessel that belonged in these waters, which it did. Aboard were 4 men from the Philippine Navy's Special Operations Group, NAVSOG divers, stationed out of the Puerto Princesa Naval Facility. They had been monitoring the Russian operation through a combination of maritime patrol reports and the kind of quietly efficient coastal intelligence network that only exists when a military has spent generations operating in the same waters. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Ramon de la Cruz, brought his boat alongside the Russian vessel and introduced himself with the unhurried calm of a man who already knew what he was going to say before he said it.
Voronov's initial reaction was suspicion. He was conducting a classified operation. The arrival of Philippine naval personnel was either a coincidence or a complication, and nothing in his career had prepared him to believe in coincidence. De la Cruz did not press. He accepted the cup of coffee a Russian sailor offered, leaned against the gunwale, and spoke conversationally about the waters around them. He mentioned the thermocline behavior at this time of year. He described the current pattern that ran along the shelf edge in the afternoons. He noted casually that the silt drift near sunken vessels in this zone tended to create false acoustic readings in sonar equipment. Voronov went very still, because De La Cruz was describing precisely every problem his team had encountered in 2 days of failed dives.
The negotiation that followed was brief and practical. De La Cruz did not ask what was inside the wreck. He did not ask why Russian naval personnel were conducting covert dive operations in Philippine territorial waters without formal authorization. He simply offered what his team could offer. 4 divers who had worked this specific stretch of seafloor for years, men who had salvaged 3 other wrecked vessels in this region over the past decade, who understood the Palawan's shelf the way mechanics understand an engine they have rebuilt with their own hands. In exchange, he asked for nothing more than documentation of the cooperation that could be filed through appropriate naval liaison channels. Voronov agreed. He did not have a better option.
What happened next was documented in the operational debrief filed by Voronov himself, later obtained through intelligence sharing agreements and referenced in a restricted naval cooperation study published internally by the Russian Navy in 2007. The report described what the Filipino divers did with a combination of precision and something that Voronov admitted he struggled to categorize using standard military terminology. He eventually settled on the phrase environmental mastery, because what De La Cruz and his 3 men demonstrated over the following hours was not simply superior diving skill, it was a form of underwater knowledge so deeply integrated into how they moved and thought that it seemed, from the surface, less like a skill and more like a sense. The first thing De La Cruz did before entering the water was sit quietly at the stern of the banca for 12 minutes, watching the surface. He watched the pattern of small ripples near the anchor chain. He watched how debris floated and in which direction it drifted. He watched the color variations in the water, subtle shifts in blue and green that told him about depth changes, sediment movement, and the behavior of the current 40 meters below. He asked one of his divers to pour a small amount of rice over the side and watched how it dispersed. Then he stood up, put on his equipment, and entered the water without ceremony. He was down for 19 minutes. When he surfaced, he told Voronov exactly where the module was and exactly how to get it.
The Russian team had spent 2 days unable to accurately locate the accessible entry point into the relay room. De La Cruz found it in under 20 minutes because he understood how current and silt interacted with the wreck structure in this type of shelf environment. He knew that the collapsed floor section Grecian had encountered would have shifted in a predictable direction given the angle of the hull and the pressure gradient of the surrounding water. He knew which section of exterior hull to cut through to create a secondary access route that would bypass the collapsed interior entirely. He knew these things not from textbooks, but from years of working this specific category of underwater environment, year after year, dive after dive, in waters that had taught him through repetition and consequence.
The cutting operation began at 0940 hours. 2 Filipino divers worked in rotation, with 1 Russian diver providing equipment support. They did not use the high-powered hydraulic cutting tools the Russian team had brought. Those tools created too much vibration and risked further structural collapse inside the already compromised hull. Instead, De La Cruz's team used a combination of manual cutting tools and a technique of controlled implosion, sealing a section of the hull and using precisely calculated water pressure differential to open access points with minimal vibration. It was an approach developed through years of Filipino salvage operations in shallow wreck environments. The Russians had never seen it. It worked with a precision that Grishin, watching from outside the hull, later described as surgical.
Inside the relay room, the diver who made the final recovery was a 26-year-old Filipino petty officer named Eduardo Santos. He had been diving in Palawan waters since he was 9 years old, first with his uncle's fishing boat, then through the Naval Auxiliary Program, then full NAVSOG operational qualification at 22. He had more hours on this specific type of South China Sea seafloor than any of the Russian divers had collectively in any comparable environment. He moved through the collapsed section of the relay room with a calm efficiency that the Russian support diver watching through the access hole could not entirely explain. Santos did not fight the wreck, he moved with it, reading the internal architecture the way a person navigates a dark room they grew up in.
Santos reached the module housing at 10:34 hours. The unit had fallen into a gap between 2 collapsed bulkhead sections, wedged at an angle with the primary attachment coupling facing downward. Extracting it required simultaneously releasing a secondary locking mechanism, rotating the unit 45 degrees through a gap barely wide enough for the housing itself, and doing all of this without triggering the collapse of the remaining bulkhead material above. Santos assessed the situation for 60 seconds. He did not rush. He did not force anything. He made 3 precise, deliberate movements. The module came free. He was back at the surface at 10:51 hours, module secure, oxygen reserves still at 30%. The entire dive had taken 71 minutes. The Russian team had spent 2 days attempting to accomplish the same thing.
Voronov was standing at the stern when Santos surfaced. The young Filipino diver passed the module to a waiting Russian technician without drama, pulled off his mask, and accepted a water bottle from one of his teammates. He did not make a speech. He did not look for acknowledgement. He simply moved to a quiet part of the boat and began going through his post-dive checklist with the focused attention of someone who treats the routine as seriously as the mission. Voronov watched him for a long moment. Then he looked at De La Cruz, and De La Cruz looked back with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving, the expression of a man who had never doubted for a moment how this was going to end.
That evening, as the equipment was being stowed and the paperwork that De La Cruz had mentioned was being quietly drafted, Voronov asked the question that had been forming in his mind for hours. He asked De La Cruz how his divers trained. Not the official answer, not the program outline, how they actually trained. De La Cruz considered the question seriously before answering. He said that NAVSOG divers in the Palawan unit did not train for the ocean. They trained in it. Not in controlled dive tanks or designated training zones with marked obstacles and safety divers at every turn. They trained in operational waters, the same waters where they would one day work, in conditions that were not controlled and not forgiving. He said the ocean here was their instructor, and it did not pass students who had not earned it. He explained the philosophy that shaped how his unit approached underwater operations, a philosophy that had less to do with equipment capability and more to do with environmental relationship. The South China Sea in this region had been the workplace of Filipino fishermen, salvagers, and warriors for centuries before any modern military doctrine existed. The knowledge encoded in NAVSOG Palawan training was not invented. It was inherited, refined, field-tested across generations, and married to modern operational requirements. His divers learned thermocline behavior because their great-grandfathers had learned to read the same water shifts to find fish. They learned current navigation because that knowledge had been keeping Filipino sailors alive in these waters for 1,000 years. Training built on that foundation produced something that pure technical proficiency could not replicate.
Voronov filed his after-action report when he returned to Moscow. He was known for tightly written, unemotional operational documents. His peers described his reports as precise, analytical, and free of anything that could not be measured. That made the language in one particular section of the Palawan debrief notable. He wrote that the Filipino divers demonstrated a category of environmental competence that exceeded the parameters of standard special operations evaluation. He wrote that their performance in the underwater environment was not simply better than his team's in that specific location. He wrote that it suggested a fundamentally different relationship between operator and environment, one that Russian naval doctrine had not accounted for and which represented a genuine capability gap. It was, for Voronov, a remarkable thing to put in writing.
The report made its way through Russian naval intelligence channels and eventually reached a joint maritime cooperation committee that included attachés from several Pacific naval forces. Within 18 months, Russian naval representatives had formally approached the Philippine Navy about expanded training cooperation, specifically in shallow water and tropical shelf dive operations. The request was handled through official channels, attributed to general partnership objectives, with no reference to the Palawan operation. Both sides understood the real reason. The Filipinos accepted with the same quiet professionalism with which they had arrived in that banca boat 3 years earlier. The arrangement that followed brought Russian naval divers to Palawan for training rotations that continued in various forms for the better part of the following decade.
Santos was promoted to Petty Officer First Class 6 months after the Palawan operation. He went on to become one of NAVSOG's lead dive instructors, training not only Filipino naval personnel, but eventually foreign operators from partner nations across the Pacific. He was 31 years old when he taught his first international training course. His students called him Kuya Eddie, older brother Eddie, which in Filipino culture is a title of respectful familiarity that says more than any formal honorific. He taught the way De La Cruz had taught him, not by lecturing about the ocean, but by taking students into it and letting it do the teaching. He said that a diver who feared the environment would always be working against it. A diver who understood it would always have it working with them. De La Cruz retired from active naval service in 2011 after 23 years. At his retirement ceremony in Puerto Princesa, attended by Philippine naval officers and a small group of foreign attachés whose nation's flags were not publicly identified, he gave a short address. He spoke about the Palawan Shelf. He spoke about the divers who had trained in those waters before him and the ones who would train thereafter. He did not speak about specific operations. He did not mention the Russian module or the wreck of the Karpov or the morning a banca boat pulled alongside a foreign naval vessel and quietly offered something more valuable than any piece of equipment. He simply said that the sea had always been generous to those who approached it with respect and patience. Then he sat down. The relationship between Filipino and Russian naval diving programs in the years following the Palawan operation produced documented changes in how Russian underwater units approached tropical shelf operations. Training protocols were updated to include environmental familiarity exercises modeled on Filipino methodology. New standards for pre-dive environmental assessment were incorporated into PDSS operational guidelines. Some of those changes traced directly to observations made during and after the Palawan mission. Military institutions rarely admit openly that they learned something fundamental from a smaller partner force. The adjustments in the documentation are subtle, phrased in the language of program development and best practice integration. But the divers who trained under those updated protocols knew where the knowledge came from. Word travels through dive communities the way current travels through water, invisibly, constantly, in every direction at once.
What makes this story remarkable is not the technical achievement of recovering a classified module from a damaged wreck in difficult conditions. Special operations units accomplish technically complex things routinely. What makes it remarkable is the nature of the advantage that made it possible. The Filipino divers did not have better equipment than their Russian counterparts. They had older equipment. They did not have more advanced training doctrine in the conventional sense. They had something harder to quantify and far more difficult to replicate quickly. A deep, lived, multi-generational understanding of a specific marine environment that had been accumulating for centuries before any modern military diving program existed. That kind of knowledge cannot be downloaded or briefed or trained in 6 months. It is built over lifetimes and inherited across generations.
There is a phrase that Filipino divers in Palawan use when they talk about working in these waters. They say they do not dive in the sea, they say they dive with it. It sounds like a poetic distinction until you watch Eduardo Santos move through a collapsed wreck in zero visibility with the calm efficiency of a man reading a familiar room. Then it sounds like the most accurate technical description possible. The sea is not a challenge to be overcome in that framework. It is a partner to be understood. And the divers who have grown up inside that understanding, who have been entering these waters since childhood, who learned to read current and thermocline and silt behavior long before they ever wore a military wetsuit, those divers carry a capability that no equipment budget can simply purchase.
Voronov never publicly discussed the Palawan operation. His career continued with distinction, and he eventually commanded Russia's Maritime Special Operations Training Center before his retirement in 2014. In an interview given to a Russian naval veterans journal 2 years after he retired, he was asked about the most significant lesson of his career. He did not talk about combat operations or technical achievements. He talked about a morning on the South China Sea when a small Filipino patrol boat arrived alongside his vessel, and 4 divers accomplished in one morning what his elite team had failed to accomplish in 2 days. He said the lesson was not about Filipino divers being superior. It was about the danger of assuming that the best technology in any given environment was the technology you brought with you, rather than the technology the environment had already built into those who knew it.
Today, Fort Magsay's Jungle Warfare School and the NAVSOG Dive Training Facility in Palawan are both recognized among international special operations communities as premier training locations. Personnel from allied and partner nations request assignment to these programs specifically because of what Filipino operators offer. Not better equipment, not larger training budgets, but a quality of environmental knowledge that comes only from generations of continuous presence in specific terrain. American, Australian, Japanese, and yes, Russian-affiliated partner nation personnel have all cycled through these programs and returned to their home units carrying a different understanding of what elite capability actually means. It means knowing your environment so completely that it becomes an extension of your own capability rather than a problem to be solved.
The Karpov module was transported back to Moscow, its encryption keys preserved, the intelligence network it served protected for several more years before being decommissioned through normal program rotation. Its recovery is listed in classified Russian naval records as a successful joint operation conducted under a maritime cooperation framework. There is no mention of the 2 failed days. There is no mention of the Banca boat, or De La Cruz, or Santos. There is no mention of the real reason the module came home intact, rather than sitting unsalvaged at the bottom of the South China Sea, while weather windows closed and oxygen reserves ran out. Classified records are written for institutional memory, not for truth. The truth lived in the divers who were there.
Santos still dives. He is in his late 40s now, and he still goes into the Palawan waters regularly, not always for operations or training, sometimes simply to dive. He says the ocean tells you things if you stay quiet enough to listen, and that the moment you stop going in is the moment it starts becoming unfamiliar. He has trained hundreds of divers across 2 decades of instruction. Some of them have gone on to instructors themselves. Some of them have gone on to operations that will never be publicly recorded. All of them carry something of the Palawan shelf inside their understanding of what it means to move through water. That specific, inherited, irreducible knowledge that no classroom produces and no technology replaces. The knowledge that turned 4 Filipino divers into the solution to a problem that 8 of the world's best had spent 2 days failing to solve.
The South China Sea is still there, cold at depth, warm at surface, running with currents that shift by season and tide and storm, layered with thermoclines that scatter sonar and fool the unprepared. Somewhere on the Palawan shelf right now, NAVSOG divers are training. Not in a pool, not in a tank, not on a groomed course with safety markers and controlled conditions. They are training in the actual water, in the real current, in the kind of environment that teaches through consequence and rewards only those who truly learn to listen. And when the next foreign unit arrives requesting assistance, when the next vessel sits anchored above a problem that the best equipment in the world cannot solve, the answer will come from the same place it has always come from the divers who do not dive in the sea, from the divers who dive with it.